Quintus Sertorius wasn't born into power, and perhaps that's exactly why he learned how to wield it so well. He came from Sabinum, a region distant from the polished elite circles of Rome, raised not by privilege but by perseverance, and guided through boyhood by the steady hand of his widowed mother, Rhea, whose quiet strength shaped him more than any military tutor ever would. He grew up on the edges of Roman nobility, close enough to see its promise, but far enough to feel its walls, and it said that he adored his mother deeply, an affection that hinted early on at his loyalty, his fierce protective nature, and the emotional depth that would later inspire armies to follow him through mountains, starvation, and betrayal. As a youth, he was taught the usual disciplines of a Roman boy: rhetoric, writing, Greek poetry, swordsmanship. But while others recited verses, Sertorius was preparing for something harder to define, a place in a world that wasn't built for people like him. He didn't fit the mold. He wasn't born into the kind of family that made senators. And when he did speak publicly, it was in a voice too raw, too provincial for the aristocrats who ruled Rome's marble halls. Cicero, the greatest orator of his time, once mocked Sertorius for being the roughest ranter he'd ever heard. But that rawness, that edge, wasn't a flaw. It was a warning. And while the aristocrats laughed at his rough speech, they failed to see the iron resolve behind it. Sertorius realized early that Rome didn't reward words unless they came with the right pedigree, so instead of trying to speak louder in the Senate, he turned to the one place where even outcasts could rise, the battlefield. He joined the Roman legions just as the northern tribes, the Cimbri and Teutons, were crashing into Roman territory like a tidal wave of chaos. He survived the devastating Battle of Orazio, one of the worst defeats in Roman history, where tens of thousands of soldiers were butchered. That he lived through that carnage wasn't just a testament to luck, it was grit, instinct, maybe even fate. And it forged in him the understanding that survival wasn't about strength alone, it was about clarity, courage, and timing. When Gaius Marius, a general who also knew what it meant to rise without noble blood, began reshaping the Roman army, Sertorius found not just a mentor, but a purpose. He volunteered for impossible tasks, including spying on the Cimbri by disguising himself, infiltrating their ranks, and learning their language. That wasn't ambition, that was obsession, the mark of someone who wasn't looking for praise but for belonging. And when he returned, mission accomplished, Marius rewarded him, not with medals, but with trust. Later, in the social war, Sertorius would lose an eye fighting for Rome's survival, but that didn't slow him down. In fact, it only made him more dangerous. Men said he could see more with one eye than most commanders could with two. He carried that scar like armor, never hiding it, using it to remind others, he didn't just speak of sacrifice, he lived it. But while Sertorius bled for the Republic began bleeding itself dry. Civil war erupted between Marius and Sulla, and Sertorius, ever loyal to the man who had trusted him, sided with Marius. It wasn't a calculated choice, it was a moral one. He believed in order, in structure, in the old Roman values that the rising tide of ambition was drowning. But loyalty in Rome was dangerous. After Sulla marched on the city and seized control, anyone tied to Marius was branded an enemy. Proscription lists were posted. Friends turned into fugitives. Names meant death sentences. And there, scrawled among the marked men, was Sertorius. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. He simply walked away from the only city he'd ever fought for. Some might say he was fleeing, but in truth, Sertorius was stepping into something much larger than himself. He wasn't running from Rome, he was chasing the dream of what Rome should have been. And in the wild mountains and fractured tribes of Hispania, he would find not just refuge, but the beginning of a new republic, one born not of privilege, but of purpose. Because when you strip a man of everything but conviction, what remains can either crumble or become legend. Sertorius chose legend. When Quintus Sertorius crossed the rugged threshold into Hispania, he wasn't stepping into safety, he was stepping into the unknown. Rome had cast him out, and the empire he once bled for now called him an enemy, a traitor. But Sertorius, ever the survivor, saw opportunity in the fractured lands beyond the Pyrenees. Hispania wasn't a place most Roman exiles chose, it was wild, fragmented, unpredictable. But that was precisely why Sertorius went. He knew that in chaos, there was space to build. Not in defiance of Rome, but perhaps in its forgotten image. The landscape greeted him with harsh winds and sharper politics. Over 40 tribes scattered across hills, valleys, and coastlines jostled for power, their rivalries as old as their myths. To a Roman senator, it would have looked like a land begging to be conquered. But Sertorius didn't see a conquest, he saw a partnership waiting to happen. He began not with swords, but with gestures. He lowered taxes, something the locals hadn't seen from a Roman in generations. He held councils, not courts. He listened, really listened. And in return, he earned something few Roman commanders ever did in the provinces, trust. He moved carefully, choosing to bribe passage through the dangerous Pyrenees rather than waste lives fighting through them. When his fellow Romans complained about the cost of paying off mountain tribes, Sertorius simply said, "When a man has much to do, nothing is more precious than time." He wasn't here to prove a point, he was here to build a future. As word spread that Sulla had taken control of Rome and begun purging his enemies, more refugees, soldiers, and thinkers fled the Italian mainland and joined Sertorius. Suddenly, Hispania became more than a hiding place, it became the last outpost of a different Rome. A Rome still loyal to the Republic, still loyal to justice. Sertorius now had men, money, and momentum, but he also had enemies. Rome wasn't going to let an outcast general carve out a kingdom on its western frontier. In 81 BC, Sulla sent an army westward. Sertorius knew the attack was coming, but winter blocked the mountain routes. He sent a legion to hold the Pyrenees, but betrayal from within allowed the Roman army to slip through. Facing overwhelming odds, Sertorius was forced to retreat with just 3,000 men. He crossed the straits to Mauritania, where even there, local kings viewed him with suspicion. But Sertorius, ever the strategist, didn't stop. He worked with pirates, attempted to seize the Balearic Islands, and eventually secured a base of power in Africa. He even embraced local legend. When told that the bones of a giant son of Poseidon lay buried nearby, Sertorius had the tomb excavated, performed rites, and paid homage to the myth. He wasn't just winning hearts through Roman discipline, he was learning how to speak the soul of a people. But fate wasn't done with him. Across the straits, the Lusitanians, a proud warrior tribe in western Hispania, were being harassed by Roman governors. They didn't need a conqueror, they needed a protector. And they turned to Sertorius. It was an unlikely union, an exiled Roman general and a tribe known more for their independence than obedience, but sometimes, history finds power in paradox. Sertorius landed near Gibraltar, met his new allies, and within weeks had crushed the Roman army sent against them. His tactics were brilliant, his sense of terrain unmatched. He didn't fight like a Roman commander. He fought like a ghost, vanishing into mountains, striking supply lines, luring legions into marshes and ambushes. But Sertorius also knew that strategy wasn't enough. His new allies needed more than war, they needed a reason to believe. And that's when a small, strange thing changed everything, a white fawn. A local hunter brought him a wild, pale deer, and Sertorius, ever the showman, seized the moment. He claimed the fawn had been sent by Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and that she whispered secrets of enemy movements to him. It was theater, yes, but theater with purpose. It gave his followers a divine reason to believe in his leadership, and it reminded them that Sertorius wasn't just a man with a sword, he was a man with a vision. His opponents laughed at the superstition, but Sertorius didn't care. While they chuckled, he was building something they couldn't understand, a republic born not of marble but of loyalty. By 80 BC, Sertorius wasn't just resisting Rome. He was shaping something larger. And deep in the hills of Hispania, a strange, beautiful idea was taking root, a Rome outside of Rome. A Rome that remembered. A Rome that bled for its people. A Rome led by a man who had every reason to give up, and didn't. When Sertorius returned to Hispania after his brief exile in Africa, he wasn't just coming back to reclaim lost ground, he was returning with a new sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of how to win a war that couldn't be fought like any other. Rome had resources, numbers, and endless reinforcements. Sertorius had mountains, loyalty, and something far more dangerous, the ability to adapt. He looked at the rugged terrain of Hispania not as a barrier, but as a weapon. He studied its valleys, its rivers, its hills, and saw an invisible battlefield where discipline alone couldn't triumph, but imagination could. He knew that facing Rome in open battle meant eventual destruction, so instead, he transformed his army and his strategy into something Rome wasn't ready for, war in the shadows. But even before the fighting began again, Sertorius knew he needed more than clever tactics, he needed unity. The tribes of Hispania were proud, fierce, and historically fractured. Rome had always benefited from their disunity, playing one tribe against another, bribing leaders, installing governors, and turning resistance into rivalry. Sertorius flipped the script. He called councils not to demand obedience, but to offer inclusion. He gave tribal leaders gifts of Roman armor and weapons, not as bribes, but as symbols of alliance. He invited their sons to study in a Roman-style academy in the city of Osca, promising them education, culture, and in time, influence. He didn't rule over the tribes, he ruled with them, and in doing so, he built a coalition not of mercenaries, but of believers. Then came the true test. In 79 BC, Rome sent Quintus Metellus Pius, a seasoned commander and sworn enemy of the Marian cause, to crush Sertorius once and for all. Metellus came with legions, discipline, and imperial arrogance. Sertorius met him not with legions, but with lightning. He trained his warriors to fight like ghosts, hit quickly, vanish faster. They struck at supply lines, ambushed patrols, turned the terrain into a trap and the forest into a fortress. Roman standards, once proud and upright, began to fall without even seeing the face of their enemy. Sertorius didn't just teach tactics, he taught patience, restraint, and resilience. His army didn't march, they glided, waited, and struck. And when tribal chiefs doubted his methods, when they yearned for the glory of direct combat, Sertorius didn't argue, he demonstrated. He brought before them 2 horses, one strong and muscular, the other small and unimpressive. He had a young man attempt to tear the strong horse's tail out in one go, and an old man remove the weaker horse's tail, hair by hair. The young man failed, sweating and straining, while the elder calmly finished the job. Then Sertorius spoke. "This is how we defeat Rome. Not all at once, but strand by strand." That lesson landed like a stone in still water, it rippled through every camp, every tent, every warrior who had ever thought brute strength was the only path to victory. Under Sertorius, these warriors didn't just become soldiers, they became a force. Metellus found himself outmaneuvered, harassed, and humiliated. He had expected an easy campaign and found himself wading through a swamp of frustration. At one point, Sertorius even challenged him to single combat, a public dare to end the war in one moment. Metellus declined, and Sertorius mocked him ever after as the old woman. Rome's confidence began to crack, and even in the Senate, whispers of Sertorius turned from ridicule to worry. How could this exile, this outcast, turn Rome's might into impotence? But Sertorius didn't let success make him careless. He kept building. More forts. More alliances. More reforms. His territories grew, but his discipline never slipped. He was fighting a war of exhaustion, and he knew that if he stayed unpredictable, he could survive. Because he didn't need to conquer Rome, he just needed to outlast it. And as the seasons turned and Metellus grew more tired, Sertorius remained a flame in the hills, never burning out, never burning too fast. He wasn't just waging a rebellion, he was mastering an art. And the empire had no answer for it. While Rome kept sending generals and legions, Sertorius built something deeper, something more dangerous than any army, a vision. He was no longer just a commander evading Rome's reach, no longer simply an outlaw holding out in the mountains. By the time the Roman Senate realized what he had done, it was too late. He had created a government, a system, an idea, a republic in exile, breathing in the hills of Hispania. And the strange thing was, it looked more Roman than the one that had chased him out. Sertorius began weaving together a civilization, not just a resistance. He established his capital in Osca, a city that became more than a military base, it became a symbol. Inside its walls, he formed a senate composed of Roman exiles and loyalists, men who had fled the political bloodletting in Italy and now found in Sertorius not just a leader, but a reminder of what Rome could have been. He gave them roles, responsibilities, and structure, not as a puppet government, but as the beating heart of a new political order. And while the Roman Senate back in the capital had become a tool for vengeance and fear, this exile Senate governed with discipline and idealism. But Sertorius didn't stop at recreating Roman politics, he went further. He knew that winning battles meant nothing if you couldn't win generations. So, he founded a school, an academy unlike anything Hispania had ever seen. There, the sons of Iberian chieftains were brought to be educated in Latin and Greek, in Roman law and military strategy, in the philosophies of Plato and the discipline of Cato. To outsiders, it looked like benevolence, but Sertorius was too smart to act without purpose. These boys were being shaped into future leaders, leaders who would carry Roman wisdom into Hispania's future. And at the same time, they served as living bridges, links between tribal pride and Roman order, between local tradition and imperial sophistication. Sertorius promised their fathers that these boys would become magistrates, judges, even generals, and those promises weren't empty. He treated them like citizens, not subordinates. But underneath that generosity was a deeper logic. These children were also hostages in all but name, ensuring that their powerful fathers stayed loyal. It was governance through education, influence through honor, and power through vision. While Rome still viewed Hispania as a fringe territory, Sertorius was turning it into a mirror of the Republic's best self, a place where justice wasn't a mask for power but a reason to govern. And the tribes noticed. They didn't just follow Sertorius because he could win battles. They followed him because he respected their customs, kept his word, and shared their burdens. He walked with his soldiers, ate their food, and slept under the same cold stars. To the Iberians, he wasn't a foreign overlord, he was one of them. When word came that another Roman general was on his way, this time a young, bold, and dangerously confident one named Gnaeus Pompey, Sertorius didn't panic. He watched. Pompey wasn't like Metellus. He was younger, faster, more ambitious. But he was also reckless. And when he entered Hispania with the swagger of a victor in waiting, Sertorius knew exactly how to handle him. In a matter of months, 2 of Pompey's legions were devastated by guerrilla attacks. His supply lines were shredded, his men demoralized. Rome's rising star was being outclassed by the one-eyed ghost in the hills. But even as he outmaneuvered one general after another, Sertorius kept a firm grip on justice. When one of the allied units began raping civilians after a victory, Sertorius didn't make excuses or look the other way, he executed the entire unit. No speeches, no delay. Just justice. He made it clear that this republic he was building wasn't just about resisting Rome, it was about becoming better than Rome. Every day, every decision, every punishment and reward, was calculated to maintain that fragile, beautiful illusion that the real Rome had been reborn far from the Tiber, nestled in the valleys and hills of Hispania, guarded not by laws alone, but by honor. And yet, for all his brilliance, Sertorius could feel the weight pressing in. He knew that every victory, no matter how brilliant, was borrowed time. Rome was relentless, patient, and bottomless in its resources. The longer the war dragged on, the more pressure mounted. But he didn't waver. Because deep down, He knew something that Rome had forgotten: empires may conquer land, but ideas conquer hearts. And the idea he had planted in Hispania wasn't just surviving. It was growing. By the year 75 BC, Quintus Sertorius had done the impossible for nearly a decade. He had defied the Roman Republic, outmaneuvered its generals, and built a state that stood not on fear, but on hope. In the rugged heart of Hispania, he had created a version of Rome that felt more Roman than the corruption that festered back home, a republic of law, dignity, and shared purpose, forged not in marble courts but in the dust of battle and the trust of forgotten tribes. But no fire, however noble, can burn forever without fuel, and Sertorius began to feel the slow chill of exhaustion. The war dragged on. Rome kept sending men, gold, and supplies. His enemies, Metellus and Pompey, weren't just surviving, they were adapting. What began as a lopsided struggle now edged toward attrition. The very strength that had once defined Sertorius, his unmatched control over both Roman and tribal forces, began to slip as old tensions resurfaced and new ambitions crept in. The longer the war lasted, the harder it became to hold everyone together. His ally, Perpenna, a Roman of aristocratic blood who had joined Sertorius after fleeing Rome, started growing restless. He was jealous of Sertorius's command, hungry for personal glory, and blind to the fact that without Sertorius, the entire cause would collapse. As resources thinned and victories became harder to win, whispers began to spread. Some questioned Sertorius's leadership. Others feared his authority. But perhaps worst of all, some began to forget what he stood for in the first place. Rome, sensing opportunity, offered amnesty and rewards to any who would betray him. 100 talents. A full pardon. A chance to go home rich and safe. Sertorius, ever the master of intelligence, knew that plots were forming around him. And in those final months, something changed. The man who had once been patient and principled began to harden. According to ancient accounts, he turned inward, grew suspicious, even cruel. Some say he drank more, punished more harshly, grew distant from the men who once called him a father. He began executing the sons of rebellious tribes, some of them students from the very academy he had founded, trying to crush insurrection before it could take root. Whether this change was real or just the natural cost of endless war, we may never know. But the light that had once glowed in Sertorius's vision began to dim. And then, one evening, as he sat at a banquet with his commanders, laughing, drinking, perhaps letting his guard down for the first time in months, Perpenna made his move. A blade hidden beneath a cloak. A circle of conspirators. And in moments, the man who had held Rome at bay for nearly 10 years was dead, murdered not by a legion, not by a consul, but by one of his own. It was a betrayal that shocked even his enemies. Pompey, upon capturing Perpenna shortly after, didn't reward him. He executed him, and then burned the letters and documents that might have revealed deeper truths, perhaps secrets that connected Rome's own senators to the conspiracy. Sertorius was gone, but his shadow lingered. The republic he built in exile crumbled without him. The Iberian tribes splintered once more. The Senate in Osca dissolved. Rome marched back in, reclaiming Hispania not with diplomacy, but with fire and steel. And yet, something had shifted. Sertorius hadn't just led a resistance, he had offered a glimpse of what Rome might have been if merit had mattered more than bloodlines, if vision had triumphed over greed. His methods, of local integration, of military reform, of balancing cultural respect with Roman structure, would echo through Roman administration for generations. Later emperors would use the same tactics, build the same schools, adopt the same strategies he pioneered, often without even knowing whose footsteps they followed. His enemies may have called him a traitor, but history rarely listens to the winners alone. In time, people remembered the man who led from the front, who bled beside his men, who turned exiles into senators and barbarians into citizens. And so, Quintus Sertorius lives not just in the dusty corners of Roman history, but in the question he left behind: what if the best version of Rome had to be built far from Rome itself?